This Filmmaker IQ lesson is sponsored by Blackmagic Design, creating the world's highest quality solutions for feature film, post-production, and television broadcast industries. Hi, John Hess from FilmmakerIQ.com, and today we'll look at the birth of film editing, the origins of cinematic language, and the beginning of continuity editing. It's hard for modern audiences who grew up with video to imagine the spectacle of the first film screening in the basement of the Grand Café in Paris in 1895 by the Lumiere brothers. Now, this film, workers leaving the Lumiere factory, as unextraordinary as it looks today, marveled audiences as something completely unseen before. In the years of film's infancy, the dancing shadows and the machines behind them were the main attraction. The content of the film was not so important. They were essentially animated photographs. But one audience member in the Grand Café screening saw much more potential. A professional magician by the name of Georges Méliès, who owned and operated the theater Robert Houdon. He attempted to buy a cinematograph machine for 10,000 francs, but the Lumieres saw him as a potential competition and refused. Unfazed, Méliès, who had also been a mechanic, bought an English-made projector called the Animatograph for 1,000 francs, reversed the mechanics, and created his own camera. Within a few months of the Grand Café screening, Méliès was making and showing his own films as part of his stage show. In the fall of 1896, Méliès was in Paris shooting a bus coming out of a tunnel when his camera jammed in the middle of the take. When he got the camera working again, the bus was gone and replaced by a hearse. When Méliès developed the film, he discovered a startling and magical thing. The bus turned into the hearse right there on the screen, something we would call the jump cut. Now, Méliès put this discovery to work right away, using jump cuts in his films to create disappearing and reappearing effects. Through his still photography and magic lantern experience, Méliès also introduced editing devices like the fade-in or fade-out, overlapping dissolves, and stop-motion photography. Through these techniques and showmanship, Méliès began to push the medium of film from mundane single-action shots into a narrative storytelling vehicle. But Méliès was very much grounded in the theater mode of thinking. His narratives were comprised of tableaus, detailed scenes all shot from the same angle, like a viewer who had the perfect theater seat. In the 500 or so films he created, Méliès never once moved the camera, even going so far as to mount the set and the moon on elaborate dollies for this famous shot from The Voyage to the Moon, instead of actually moving the camera, which would have been much more practical. Across the Atlantic Ocean, another key figure was getting his start in the infant filmmaking industry, Edwin S. Porter. Porter started off as a Vitascope projectionist, setting up the first Edison projector in Coster and Bial's Music Hall in New York City in April of 1896. For a few years, he operated his own equipment until 1900, when he joined Edison Manufacturing Company and became head of production for Edison's Skylight Studio in 1901. For the next 5 years, he served as Edison's go-to director and cameraman. Porter's projectionist background gave him some unique insight into film. Greatly influenced by the work of Georges Méliès, especially 1902's A Trip to the Moon, which he often duplicated for distribution for Edison, albeit illegally, Porter decided to try his hand at a narrative film with 1903's Life of the American Fireman. Now, firemen were common subject matter for early films, but what Porter did was rather unique. He took stock footage from the large Edison library and spliced it together with staged scenes to create a fictional narrative. Porter was still stuck in this tableau mentality, constructing each shot as a complete scene. Temporal overlaps, that's where action is duplicated from one shot to the other, were common, as in this opening shot where the firemen all rush down the pole, followed by a shot at the bottom of the pole before the firemen land. Now, to our modern sensibilities, that looks like a mini flashback. Porter does this again in the fire rescue, first showing the drama from inside the building, and then moving outside, showing the same exact rescue from the perspective of the firemen. Now, this editing looks long and clunky to our modern sensibilities, but this overlap was acceptable to contemporary audiences who were still amazed by these flicker machines and really looking for animated photographs. But the novelty would wear off, and Porter himself would push the narrative envelope a little bit further by the end of 1903 with his next big film, The Great Train Robbery. Now, here Porter is more decisive in his cutting. Although each scene is still one master take, he cuts straight between the scenes without using fades or dissolves, and, most importantly, without letting the scene reach its logical end. For example, Porter cuts out of this shot before the train has cleared the frame. Now, this departure shows how filmmakers were beginning to see editing's ability to compress time in favor of impact over reality. Porter was beginning to forge a new cinematic language. Through his work, we start to see that the most basic unit of cinema was not the scene, as Méliès and his contemporaries thought, but the shot. Meaning came not only of the spatial arrangement of objects and actors in a frame, like it does in theater and in still photography, but in the way that shots are arranged in time. But like Georges Méliès before him, Porter would only take editing so far. Cinema would require another artist to build on their work and expand the editing vocabulary. And in one of those serendipitous moments of history, Porter would inspire just that artist. In 1908, just before leaving Edison to start his own production company, Porter hired a young, starving actor to fill the lead part in Rescued from an Eagle's Nest. This would end up being the first break of a 40-year-long career for one David Wark Griffith. The seventh child of a Confederate Army colonel from a rural district in Kentucky, David Wark Griffith tried everything from hop picking, selling encyclopedias door to door, to acting. His lifelong ambition was to be a writer, falling in love with Victorian style of literature, especially that of Charles Dickens. But Griffith's own plays and poems were rather unremarkable. Acting on advice from a friend, Griffith tried his hand at writing scenarios for movie production companies. Working under the stage name Lawrence Griffith, he submitted an adapted play to none other than Edwin S. Porter. Porter rejected it for having way too many scenes, but he hired the young, handsome Griffith to star in one of his films. Well, that's when the filmmaking bug bit. Griffith found a position at Biograph, a production company struggling with debt but looking for directors. After directing a single reel, The Adventures of Dolly, which was shot in 2 days, Griffith was given a $45 a week director's contract. Now, under contract to Biograph, Griffith would make over 450 films from 1908 to 1911, pushing cinema out of the primitive tableau mentality and into a multi-shot medium that we would now recognize. One of Griffith's first inventions was the cut-in, first used in The Greaser's Gauntlet in 1908, just 4 months after his first film for Biograph. Griffith cut from a medium-long shot of a hanging tree to a full shot in the middle of the scene to emphasize the emotional impact of an exchange between two actors, a brand new concept. Griffith continued to experiment with alternating shot lengths, using multiple camera setups to create a scene through what's called continuity editing. Now, continuity editing is cutting between shots with the purpose of maintaining a smooth sense of continuous space and time. With multiple camera setups being used, the 180-degree rule evolved out of practice. Griffith, as well as his contemporaries, discovered that if you kept the camera on one side of the axis of action, that's the imaginary line where movements and eye lines occur, you can avoid continuity problems of confusing geography when cutting from one angle to another. Now, Griffith's next invention in editing would be one that had become his favorite: intercutting or cross-cutting. Bouncing between two different scenes in parallel action, which he first put to use in After Many Years based on the poem Enoch Arden, showing a shipwrecked man and the woman he left at home. Now, this is commonplace in today's cinema language, but wholly new at the time. Biograph's managers thought the experiment was dangerous and would be confusing to the public, but Griffith stood firm, likening the technique to the writing styles of Dickens. It paid off, After many years, was hailed as a masterpiece. Griffith upped the ante again in 1909 with The Lonely Villa, intercutting between three parallel actions: a woman held up in a house, robbers trying to break in, and a husband rushing home to rescue. Griffith amps up the tension by continuously building up the tempo of the cuts faster and faster to get to the ultimate cinematic climax. Through varying the spatial distance with long, medium, and close-up shots and the temporal length of the shot, Griffith began to establish the tenets of classic Hollywood continuity editing. Through practical problem-solving experimentation, he and contemporary filmmakers who often copied his style brought about concepts like the establishing shot, reverse shots, matching eye lines, everything that we think about in terms of continuity editing. Now, by 1911, Griffith was ready to pursue bigger and more ambitious projects, more ambitious than the managers of Biograph could stomach. Oh, he left, and after a brief stint with Mutual Pictures, Griffith struck out on his own. In 1914, Griffith released an independent film that would be cinema's most expensive film to date, but also the world's first blockbuster, The Birth of a Nation. A major hit, but condemned as racist even during its time, The Birth of a Nation was the culmination of all of Griffith's editing and cinematic techniques. But the pro-Ku Klux Klan film didn't sit well with many. Censorship boards requested alterations. Many states flat out banned the film as riots broke out at premieres in Boston, Atlanta, and Chicago. A born and raised Confederate Kentucky colonel's son, Griffith couldn't understand the charge of racism, and he saw all this as an attack on him personally. He responded by publishing a pamphlet, The Rise and Fall of Free Speech in America, and vigorously defended his film and his right to make it against what he thought was intolerance. In 1916, he set out to make a massive epic decrying just that: intolerance. Intercutting four separate narratives, Intolerance cost nearly $2.5 million to produce, sinking most of the profits from Birth of a Nation, which only cost $115,000. The first cut ran 8 hours before Griffith came to his senses and trimmed it down to a tidy 3.5 hours. But that wasn't enough. Intolerance bombed at the box office. Though Griffith would still go on to direct 26 more features, he would die still paying off the debt on Intolerance. D.W. Griffith remains a controversial figure of history, but he almost single-handedly invented the conventions of editing that would establish the continuity style of cutting that is still very much with us today. His greatest artistic and financial gamble failed, but Intolerance was not destined for obscurity. Instead, it would be the key to develop a new style of editing derived by Soviet filmmakers who studied and picked apart Griffith's editing style, a new theory of editing they called montage, which we'll explore in the next lesson. Even in the birth of cinema, the first 20 years of filmmaking, the history of editing has been a story of filmmakers learning from each other and adding their own voice into the mix. Cinema was becoming a language, and editing was the syntax. Learn it, use it, and go make something great. I'm John Hess, and I'll see you at filmmakeriq.com.